Hello, Natasha. It's so lovely to see you on a Saturday afternoon in a virtual world.
Yeah, this is exciting. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody, to Linden New Art series of Meet the Artist. Today, we are talking to Natasha Bieniek, who's one of our current exhibiting artists, and we'll be talking to her about her current exhibition and some of the other projects that she's recently been working on. If you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube, there's lots of opportunities to ask questions, but if you'd like to ask a question, you need to log in to whatever platform you're using and use the chat and the Q&A sections in whatever platform you're using. Our gallery administrator, Chloe, is working behind the scenes and she'll monitor the chat and pass on any questions that you might have as we have a conversation. Before I get started, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the country on which we virtually meet today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the land. Today, I'm joining you from the lands of the Yalukit Willam clan of the Bunurong people of the Greater Kulin Nation, and Natasha is joining us from the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. I pay my respects to elders, both past, present and emerging. And while we meet virtually this afternoon, tonight draws upon the ancient history of this land and reflects the millennia of experiences of First Nations people coming together to celebrate, to learn and to connect. Natasha, I'm going to introduce you and give everyone a little bit of a blurb about you because you've done some pretty amazing things in your, artistic practice. You're best known for your miniature oil paintings, and they really link to the tradition of 16th century miniature painting, and you kind of smash that up with contemporary living now and present day obsession with our phones and iPhone culture in particular. Yeah. The exhibition currently on show at Linden brings together a set of works that have not been seen together before, including your standout painting by Ophelia, which was the winner of the Win Prize in 2015. You are a 7th time Archibald Prize finalist, and you've held many solo exhibitions in Australia and overseas, most notably at Art Basel in Hong Kong and Sydney Contemporary. You've exhibited extensively in both metropolitan and regional public galleries, including the National Portrait Gallery in Canberra, the Mornington Peninsula Gallery, Gippsland Art Gallery in Sale, Warrnambool Art Gallery and Tweed Regional Gallery in New South Wales. You are represented by This Is No Fantasy here in Melbourne and Jan Murphy Gallery in Brisbane. So if people want to come and collect your work, that's behaviour we encourage wholeheartedly. So welcome, Natasha. Thank you for joining us on a stunningly, icy cold Melbourne afternoon.
It is a bit cold, isn't it?
It is a bit chilly. I thought to get started that what we might do is bring up some images of some of your most recent work and talk about some of the portraits from the Archibald Prize that you've recently entered. And I'm going to ask Chloe to share the screen and show some images in a second. We're going to begin really by looking about, the first is a portrait of Wendy Whiteley, who of course was married to Brett and is currently included in the Archie 100 exhibition, which is celebrating the Art Gallery of New South Wales 100 years of presenting this show. And I think it's a really interesting kind of exhibition because it shows this sort of changing face in how we capture images. And then we'll have a look at your most recent portrait, which is really an extraordinary painting of the actor and Linden local, because she lives around the corner from us. And, if you live in St Kilda often, you might run into Rachel Griffiths, which is on show currently as part of this year's Archibald Prize. Tell me first, Natasha, and I think we're just having a little bit of a moment as we're trying to connect to PowerPoint, but it will happen, I'm sure, in a second. Tell me, how did you choose the subjects for the portraits?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll start with Wendy. I first met her at a dinner held at the Art Gallery of New South Wales back in 2015. And that dinner was to celebrate the winners of the Archibald Win and Sulman that year. And we just happened to be seated directly opposite one another. And we certainly hadn't met before, but I recognised her instantly. You know, she has this very iconic look with her beautiful headscarves and this sort of terrific, bold statement jewellery. And I felt drawn to her quite immediately. And after our first conversation, I just knew that I had to paint her. It did feel so right, because I had spent the previous 18 months painting inner city gardens, and I couldn't believe that she'd spent 20 years transforming what was once this unused railway land into this living, breathing sanctuary. You know, her garden is really a masterpiece. And for those who haven't visited the garden, it's situated just at the foot of her house in Lavender Bay, and it kind of overlooks the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And it was once filled with like weeds and junk and lots of hard rubbish, and it's actually council property. But regardless, she's invested millions of dollars of her own money and also employed 2 full-time gardeners into a space that technically isn't hers. And I just love that she's a breaker of rules, and she never asked for the council's permission. She just went ahead and did it. But the other reason I really wanted to paint her was because she is often referred to as Brett Whiteley's former wife and muse. But in my eyes, you know, she's so much more than that. And she's really an inspiration. And by painting her, I really wanted to make the public more aware of her story. And I think, you know, creating that garden is probably one of her greatest legacies. It will be one of her greatest legacies. But with the painting of Rachel, the situation, I suppose, was quite unusual from the beginning, in that Rachel actually asked me to paint her rather than the other way around. So I suppose our usual roles were really reversed. I actually had no intention of entering the Archibald Prize this year. And although I was quite flattered, you know, it's not every day that a celebrity calls you out of the blue and asks you to paint their portrait. I was definitely reluctant to agree, and that was because the timing just couldn't have been worse. I was heavily pregnant with my second child, and it basically meant that I'd be producing the painting alongside a newborn and a 2-year-old, both of whom I look after full time. So I wasn't really sure how I was going to cope with that pressure, or, you know, whether it was even going to be possible to make the painting. But I made my decision after listening to about 8 podcast interviews that featured Rachel back to back, and I discovered that she was highly intelligent and somebody who spoke about her work as an actor and a director with a lot of passion and conviction and clarity. And, you know, I have a history of painting strong women who have made a mark on the art world, and she's certainly someone who falls into that category. But I suppose the other consideration that I had as well is that the painting and the process was going to be part of a documentary series on the ABC called Finding the Archibald, and that the first episode just aired last week. But it basically meant that I had a film crew kind of documenting the entire process, from our first meeting and our first conversation to the sitting, to me creating the portrait, to then revealing it to Rachel, and then you know, finding out whether I was going to be a finalist or not. And that, you know, certainly added a lot of extra pressure to the situation. But yeah, you can see me in that. The next episode comes out on Tuesday.
And I think it's really interesting because there's a really special relationship between the person who is the portrait is being taken of, and the artist as well. It's a really interesting dynamic. So to have that kind of documented, when normally that's quite a private exchange between people, is quite interesting.
Yeah, that's
in terms of
right.
Like when you start to make the work for portraits in particular, do you meet them first and then do some drawings and have a conversation with them and take photographs, or do you sort of use documentary photographs and go back to the studio and make the work that way?
Yeah, I mainly work from photographs, but I also spent some time sketching Rachel and Wendy. You can see the sketch that I did of Rachel just on the screen now, and that's actually part of the conditions of entry. I think you have to spend at least an hour working from life. It's not a usual part of my process, but I quite enjoyed being able to examine their faces in quite an intimate way. But I certainly wouldn't have been able to create the whole painting from life, you know, because we're all quite busy people, and, you know, I just wouldn't have been able to have that level of accessibility. I wouldn't say my paintings are a direct copy of a photograph. Both of the artworks are quite realistic, but when you see them in the flesh, they certainly look like paintings rather than photographs. You can really see that sort of buttery texture of the paint. But the portrait of Rachel is actually a composite of 3 different images. So I used one image for the face and the body, and a separate image for the arms, and then a separate image for the drapery in the foreground. And then I kind of all collaged them together. So the final composition never really existed as a singular photograph to begin with.
And I think what's really interesting in this kind of relationship, in a way, these are faces that people know. So I think one of the things about the Archibald is that there's kind of this warmth in that you recognise people that you admire when you go and see the exhibition. But also there's that kind of, I think it's always very tricky for an artist, because the general public will come and say, oh, does that look like Rachel? Does that look like Wendy? You know, there's always this really interesting conversation. And I think one of the things that when you're making portraits is really to capture a sense of the person. So how do you, you know, gauge what the person is like when you're often having, you know, interesting conversations? But specifically, I think with Rachel, you were having an interesting conversation, but that was a documented conversation as well. How do you kind of gauge what someone's like to kind of include that?
Yeah, look, I think you have to try and get to know the subject as much as possible. I think that dynamic between the artist and the sitter is quite important, and it can really mean the difference between an engaging painting and a real dud. And, you know, I with Wendy, I actually spent quite a lot of time with her before I started the painting. We had crossed paths a number of times at different gallery events that year, and I had spent quite a lot of time in her house, just having cups of tea. And I think after many conversations, I did feel like I gained some insight into her character. And, you know, she's someone who I feel is very strong-willed and strong in character, but she has suffered a lot of grief and tragedy in her life. And I think the garden really became her salvation, and it rescued her from a very dark place. And that's something that I was thinking about a lot with that portrait. But with the painting of Rachel, as you said, like, we actually got to know each other in front of a camera. We had some of our first conversation on the camera, and I almost felt like I was part of some kind of strange reality TV show. But we did also spend time off camera. And I do feel like there were times when she did open up to me, and I think we did click quite well. But with her portrait, I really just had to follow my intuition, especially because, you know, we didn't know each other that well. But that portrait is certainly more about capturing a private moment that was unfamiliar to the public eye, and it is a very intimate portrait.
And I think it's really interesting because for someone like for Rachel, her life is in front of the cameras. But for the rest of us, that's a really kind of confronting experience to kind of be involved in that environment. I guess one of the things that lots of people often ask when they see your work, because it's so delicate and so detailed, is how long did it take to make a painting like the one that we see on the screen with Rachel?
Well, I was working under quite difficult conditions with that painting because I had a newborn baby. It took about 8 weeks all up, but I was working very odd hours. It was very common for me to start a painting session at like 4 a.m., where I just kind of set my alarm. I'd splash some water on my face and I'd roll out of bed and put studio lights on. And I found that was the only time where I could get any very serious kind of uninterrupted work done. And that was at the back of being woken up 3 times overnight by the baby as well. So it was incredibly exhausting work. But the portrait of Wendy was a lot smoother in that it took about 6 weeks of full-time work, but that was also a very complex painting, and so it probably took a little bit longer. But yeah, they're very laborious works, that's for sure.
I think also one of the things when I look at paintings and portraits of people, one of the things I always think about is that people often don't like their photograph being taken. So I imagine like for someone sitting in the space to have their portrait taken, it's quite kind of confronting because it's really someone's version of how they experience you and look. And there's that really internal world, you know, between how you think you look and what you actually look like. What was it like for you in terms of the challenge of like painting famous people?
Well, both of them are quite used to having people looking at them. You know, Wendy was Brett Whiteley's main muse. She was very comfortable in front of me and comfortable in front of the camera as well. And Rachel was exactly the same. Like, was very, very comfortable with the art, with my gaze, the artist's gaze. But I think the biggest challenge is just capturing, you know, their essence. And prior to each sitting, I guess I had to think about what would make a good portrait. And it would have been quite straightforward for me to paint Wendy or Rachel and achieve a good likeness. You know, that's the sort of easier part for me because I've painted people for 20 years and, you know, I'm quite confident with the genre, but a purely representational painting doesn't necessarily make a great painting. And with both of the works, I really wanted to go deeper and grab onto some kind of truth. But my main intention was for the paintings to appear both honest and authentic, and especially with my portrait of Rachel, I suppose painting a celebrity was a new experience for me. So I had to think about her public life versus her private one. And I certainly wanted to steer clear of the typical celebrity image that most people might associate her with. And I certainly didn't want to mirror any of her previous characters, especially in her more iconic roles. But the work is really about Rachel in her home, and you know, it's not a glossy magazine image. She's not airbrushed in any way, and it's real, it's imperfect, and you know, it does reflect an intimate moment. And those sentiments are also echoed in my painting of Wendy, but I would say she's more of a cultural icon rather than a celebrity. And you know, each painting, it's about problem solving, and you know, they present their own unique set of challenges. And yeah, just hope that answers your question.
It does indeed. And so what we might do now is we might take down the PowerPoint, and then what I'll do is, because everyone who's joining us may not have seen the exhibition yet at Linden, because of course Melbourne has been in lockdown yet again. So what I thought I would do is to share a small video of the exhibition as it appears here at Linden. And of course, we want people to come and see your work in the flesh, and then we'll start to have a conversation about Halcyon.
Sounds good.
Hello, everybody. We have just actually gone a little bit down in our internet, so we're just going to bring Natasha back up now. I'll be 1 second. Sorry, Natasha.
Hey.
Just
Okay.
actually crashed here at the gallery, so I apologise.
No problem.
What I might do is, because we kind of went down through the middle of the video of your exhibition, I might just replay that so everyone's got that fresh in their mind, and we'll get going again. Sorry, guys. Natasha, they are such exquisite little paintings, and every when I've been in recently, before lockdown, it was just so delightful to watch people getting up so close to them to have a look at them. All of the work in this exhibition depicts gardens and green spaces, and I'm really interested in why you've chosen that as a subject matter for this show.
Yeah, well, I actually concentrated purely on portraits and figurative painting for about 15 years, but a shift in 2015 occurred towards landscape painting, and it was at that time where I became quite interested in the way that people relate to nature, particularly within this urban or inner city context. And in a way, it was really a reflection of the way that I was living my life. You know, I've always lived quite close to Melbourne CBD and work close to the city as well. And I think as a culture, we're busier and more work orientated than ever before. And I actually created most of the paintings in the exhibition during a pre-COVID time. And it was at that time where, you know, inner city living is very busy, it's fast-paced, it's noisy, and it can really be an assault on the senses. And I think many of us are totally divorced from the natural world, and we rarely question the implications on our physical and mental well-being. And I'm certainly interested in the notion that a stronger connection to nature could enable us to further thrive as a species and have a more satisfying existence. And I think that was certainly the case for me during Melbourne's lockdown last year, where, you know, we were only allowed out of our house for 1 hour a day at some points. And it was during that time where, you know, the only joy that I could experience was when I was able to go, you know, to my local park or my local garden. And it's, you know, these, you know, small pockets of nature, which are just like the gardens that I've depicted in my paintings, that offer a great sense of tranquility and respite from the chaos of a major developed city, or in the case of last year, you know, a very stressful situation due to the pandemic. And it's these spaces that really enable us to recharge our batteries and recharge our souls. And they're certainly some of the things that I was thinking about with this exhibition.
And as you were talking, Natasha, I couldn't help but think of the Japanese have a really great term for this, and they call it forest bathing. And in Japan, sometimes a doctor will prescribe you to go and have forest breathe, to kind of engage and look at that green space, breathe that oxygen. I know when Lyndon was out of our building for our renovation and we worked at Domain House near the Botanical Gardens, every day I just walked through the Botanical Gardens at lunchtime, and it just felt like I was just breathing in this amazing fresh air and seeing all those layers of green. It's such a good thing for you.
Yeah, it definitely is.
One of the things that's really also acutely fascinating about your paintings is just how detailed they are. They're so meticulous. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of making the work? And I think one of the really interesting things is, like, I know I've had the joy of seeing some of your paintbrushes, and sometimes some of those paintbrushes almost look like they've just got like one little hair on them that you're using. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that process for us.
Yeah, well, as I said before in reference to my portraits, it's a very slow and painstaking endeavour. And even though that I have been working on a miniature scale for about 11 years now, it's, you know, it's still quite challenging. I approach the work quite traditionally, and a preparation starts with sanding the support surface, whether that's some dibond or some wood, and then forming a ground with gesso. And the paintings are built up with about 6 or 7 layers of paint, and I add a little bit more detail and a little bit more information within each layer, and I use very tiny brushes for accurate precision. I'm often asked whether I use a magnifying glass, and I don't, but I do work from an iPad, so I can zoom in and see the images quite well. But I would say that this kind of work, it requires a steady hand, a lot of concentration and a lot of patience. But I suppose the main difference between painting on a small scale as opposed to a large scale is that there's really not a lot of room for error. So one little slip can really spell disaster. And that's the case in particularly within the portraits. If something in the face, for example, is even 1 millimeter out, it can really blow the painting right out of proportion. And it can take several attempts to achieve a very satisfying result. But yeah, I like it because it still keeps me quite challenged, and that's why I keep producing the work that I do.
You paint in oil, which is a really, it's an old medium. Lots of people have painted in oil for a long time, and yet the works themselves have this kind of futuristic edge to them. I'm interested in more about learning about how you approach the current technology within our worlds and practice, And how that you feel like that's kind of translating into your painting practice?
Yeah. Well, I suppose to answer that question, I do have to talk about my interest in historic painting. Um, my work does reference the ancient tradition of miniature painting, which the paintings that I'm particularly interested in were significant in England and France during the 16th century. And they're beautiful, very intricate little paintings, and they often resembled medals or pendants, and their purpose was to portray an individual's characteristics. And they often acted like a keepsake or a memento, or they provided a visual representation for someone afar, because photography wasn't invented at the time. It was actually in the 19th century, with the invention of photography, that actually led to the decline of the miniature portrait. But my intention was to revive this tradition, but in a present day context. And I think the scale of my work, it's quite indicative of the way that we often view images today. You know, as a culture, we're glued to our iPhones and other devices, and it essentially miniaturizes the way that we see images. You know, I just think about scrolling through my Facebook feed or my Instagram feed, and there's one little portrait after another. And, you know, our phones have really become an extension of ourselves, and that's sort of something that I'd interested in referencing in my work. So the work really draws on the notions of the past and the present and bringing those two together. But in terms of a technical side of things, I have quite a strong correlation with modern working methods. I embrace technology, and I don't see the camera or the computer as the assassin of painting, but rather a vehicle to keep painting moving forward. A lot of my experimentation happens digitally. I treat Photoshop like a sketchbook. You know, colours, compositions are pushed and pulled and manipulated. And, you know, as I said, I paint from an iPad, which is a very good modern day tool.
And I think one of the really interesting things about how you've presented the work is the framing of the work as well. So whilst they might be, you know, small paintings, you've chosen to frame them in a particular way, and you've also chosen to use a really highly reflective surface, which is called dibond. And I'm wondering if you can just talk to us about your choice for framing and that reflective surface that you're really interested in playing around with.
Yeah, sure. The landscape component of the artwork is actually directly painted onto the dibond. I think some people have mistaken, they've thought that I've glued the painting onto the dibond, but it's actually directly painted onto the surface. The dibond, I see it as part of the artwork rather than the frame. But the dibond is actually a coated aluminium, and it's an industrial or architectural product, and it's usually used for things like interiors and exteriors and signage, and even, you know, like an object like an ATM or something might be made out of it. It's very strong, it's archival, and it's not usually used as a base for oil painting, but it is definitely growing in popularity. But I'm really attracted to its reflective and sleek surface, and it almost resembles a piece of technology, and that really embodies my interest in present day image trends, because as a culture I think we are obsessed with recording and documenting our surroundings, and as a result we do experience our world through screens. And I do wonder how that impacts on real experience, and that notion is certainly referenced in my paintings' format and their resemblance to an iPhone or a device.
And I think one of the interesting things with the larger works that you framed in the sort of the larger surrounds is that as a viewer you become part of the work. So in a way that you're kind of reflected into it, as well as the reflection of the trees. And in the gallery space we've got a tree sort of in one of the windows that reflects in as well. So there's this really interesting kind of conversation, I think, between us as humans looking at a work that has reflected nature in it, reflected self in it, looking back at a painting as well. And I'm interested in so much of that work seems, made for an Instagram moment. And certainly when I've seen people photographing the work, it seems to be that they're trying to capture the best angle. And I'm really interested in how you feel about people engaging with your work like that.
Yeah, well, I was actually really happy with how those particular artworks look in the space at Linden. And yeah, the idea is actually for people to interact with them. Yeah, as you say, the artworks that you're referring to, they have a very large mirrored surface, which is paired with a very tiny little painting which sits just above the center line. And I think that large reflection, it really adds this luminosity, but it also brings this motion and movement and life into what would normally be this kind of stagnant two-dimensional form. And the beauty of these artworks is that they shift and they change with their environment. And as you say, the viewer's reflection does become integrated into the composition. And the idea was to provoke a strong sense of intimacy. And, the viewer's reflection becomes integrated into the composition, as I said, and it really forces the viewer to reflect upon both themselves and the subject of my painting. And I'm really interested in that dynamic.
I think one of the things that's really interesting in your work is it kind of really examines our kind of obsession with present day image making in a way. So we are all photographers now. We are all people who put content into a world.
Yeah.
Do you think your work is kind of an antidote to our fleeting attention spans and our increasing detachment from nature? So we're in a gallery kind of documenting. So is it kind of an antidote?
Well, in a way, yeah. I think as a culture, we are, we're constantly bombarded with images and advertising, and I think, well, painting in itself is a perfect antidote to that. It is unlike a quick snapshot in that it really forces you to slow down, even if you're the viewer or if you're the artist making the work. You get to know the subject over kind of an extended period of time. I like the fact that I can reflect on, present day culture in a very poetic way. And I hope that the simple act of, putting something in paint will, make the viewer think more deeply about the subject matter.
And do you think that people experiencing viewing these works is similar to being in nature itself, or do you see them as being quite different experiences?
I don't think it's the same experience, but I do feel my exhibition, it does feel quite calming in the gallery space. My exhibition in particular, it's somewhat removed from the other exhibitions in the gallery, and it does feel quite peaceful and quiet. And I've always been really interested in that viewer painting relationship, and I think the scale of my work, it certainly does aim to draw the viewer in and experience it intimately. And I think an audience can also feel quite absorbed by my artworks, even though they are quite tiny. For me, I think the gardens that I've depicted, they're some of the most sensory stimulating and information-rich environments that anyone can really ever encounter. And I certainly think, I'd like the viewer to experience that when they're visiting my exhibition.
And I think it's really interesting that there's this kind of tension between, I guess, the landscape and then people. And I'm really interested in your relationship in terms of, like, we've talked about portraiture. So you've got a sort of a strong body of work of painting really strong, amazing women and capturing that, as well as this kind of, wanting this kind of preservation of the natural world and the beautiful world. Is there one that you prefer more or over the other?
No, I would say not really. I think I'll jump between portraiture and landscapes and possibly other genres. as my practice evolves. I definitely consider myself a portrait painter and a landscape painter. For me, you know, from the technical point of view, there's not a lot of difference between the two. I think sometimes I feel that the portraiture is a little bit more challenging, and I think it's a little bit harder to get right. But look, I just jump between both. Whatever I feel like creating at any time, or whatever project that I'm working on.
And I'm just going to invite people, if they've got a burning question to ask Natasha, to jump into the chat and we'll bring them into the conversation. But Natasha, what's coming up next for you in terms of your practice?
Oh, well, I'm still supposed to be on maternity leave. If such a thing for an artist exists,
it should definitely.
Yeah, well, it does it. the emails still keep coming in. Yeah, my little baby is 7 months old, so I have had a little bit of time to concentrate on her. But I've got a group show coming up in Brisbane, and I'm working on that. And other than that, I'm just spending time in my studio experimenting before I really commit to any big exhibitions. And that's a wonderful place to be in.
And I think it gives you just time to stop and breathe and think about what the next thing might be, and experiment and play, because that's what artists should be doing.
Yeah, look, when you've got sort of deadlines back to back, sometimes you don't get that experimentation time in, and I think that's actually really important. And so, yeah, I'm definitely going to take some time to do that. It's hard because, your art dealers are always sort of getting in touch, asking for work, and, you don't want to let them down, but you also need time to, keep making interesting work. I think about that quote by Brett Whiteley, and he said that repetition kills the spirit, and that resonates with me a lot. So I think you have to keep making new, interesting work, and keep sort of getting out of your comfort zone.
And I think one of the things about portraiture that I'm always fascinated about is it always feels a little bit almost, how like you have a relationship with a hairdresser, and you it's quite an intimate relationship, and sometimes you have conversations with your hairdresser that you would never have with a perfect stranger, in a sense. Do you find that when you're having conversations with people whose portraits you are going to depict, that sometimes they reveal things to you that you think, wow, I wouldn't have thought that, or I'm surprised that they've told me this story?
When you just said that, I couldn't help but think about Ando, that show on TV, because I think that's what happens with him. I don't know how produced that show is, but yeah, look, I think that did actually happen. I think, my sitters did get to a point where they felt quite comfortable with me, and they did kind of express themselves, and, we did sort of open up and have those chats, and yeah, it was great. It was nice to get to know my subjects on more of an intimate and personal level. Yeah.
And I think it really helps you get to understand them in a way. And Ruth's just asked a really interesting question about, do you paint in the Flemish method, and do you use mediums in your oils? So quite a, this is a nerd question for the oil painters.
I paint, I don't actually use a lot of mediums at all. I like to keep the paint very pure, and I use mainly a Winsor & Newton paint, and those particular oil colours are very oily, so they don't actually need a lot of medium at all. And the paintings are built up with several layers of paint, and each layer is quite thin though, so you wouldn't actually realise that they are built up so much. But no, to answer your question, I don't use mediums.
And can I maybe just ask, Natasha, can you just explain what a medium is for people who are not oil painting nerds?
Okay, yeah. A medium is like a liquid that you might mix in with the oil paint, and certain mediums might speed up the drying of paint, whilst others might slow it down. Yeah, there's all sorts of things on the market that you can get to mix in with the paint. Depends what kind of style you want to do, I guess, whether you want to do lots of translucent layers or whether, you know, you want to build it up in an impasto way, where, you know, if the paint's really thick, you might want to put something in it that will help dry it, because oil paint, you know, can take weeks to dry.
And also it depends what temperature you're actually painting in too. Sometimes you need to control some of that depending on how you're working as well. So Caitlin has asked, she'd love to know where you get your paintbrushes from and what material are they made from?
You can buy the paintbrushes that I use pretty much at any art supply shop, and they're a synthetic brush. I think they're actually a watercolor brush rather than oil brush. I don't like the natural hairs because they sort of splinter out. But the brushes that I use are very soft, and I think they're called a Thames and Hudson brush. And yeah, the smallest brush that I have, it's a 20-0. So to sort of explain that, a 0 brush is about the size of a match head, and then 20-0 is 20 times smaller than that. Yeah, so it's just it's a nice little brush. It's got a maroon handle, and you can get it anywhere.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Natasha. It's just been such a pleasure listening to you talk so passionately about your work. I hope for those of you who haven't been able to be in and see the show at Linden that you do come. You've got until the 22nd of August to experience the thing in real life. And while Melburnians are allowed out in real life, we encourage you to visit us and to come and see the work. Our next Meet the Artist session will be with Vipu Srivalasa, who is also showing alongside Natasha in the main gallery downstairs with his exhibition Wellness Deity. If you'd like to learn more about Natasha's work, hop onto our website at lindenarts.org, and you can find Natasha's catalogue essay, which has a conversation that has been written by our curator Juliet, and a conversation that really, and an essay that really stemmed from lots of conversations with and studio visits with you, Natasha, over the last little while. Join our mailing list to keep up to date. And thank you again for everyone who persisted with us, even though the internet dropped out. But that is what happens when you go live in the world. Every now and then it does play a few nasty tricks on us. So thanks so much, Natasha, for joining us today, and have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Pleasure.